Hey there guys, welcome to my disappointment video for the Resident Evil Village DLC that is releasing for October of this year. So I expressed before in a community post on YouTube that when I watched the showcase of Resident Evil Village's DLC content, I mentioned that I was very disappointed and I was honestly offended by what they showed for DLC content for Resident Evil Village. And I never thought it could ever create such emotions within me because I feel so conflicted with this DLC, and I just feel like new Capcom is displaying some level of insecurity, and they're honestly mirroring the same insecurities that are being expressed by the fan base of the Resident Evil series. And it's really showcasing with the way they marketed this DLC, with the way they presented the DLCs. It's not that good, and that's why I'm expressing a lot of disappointment, and I'm feeling very offended by what they showed. And this is what this video is for. But what I have for this video is we have the three parts of the DLC. So we have the Shadows of Rose DLC, we have the Mercenaries update, and we have the third person perspective coming to Resident Evil Village. And then in the final part of this, there is some coverage of Resident Evil 4 Remake and some new gameplay. So that's what will be shown in this video. But right now, let's showcase some stuff with the Shadows of Rose trailer. So this is directly taken from the Gold Edition trailer of Resident Evil Village. So this is 16 years after Resident Evil Village. So apparently with Shadows of Rose, they wanted to make it a DLC, yet this time jump of 16 years should warrant an actual main game experience. Like, this should warrant Resident Evil 9, not a DLC. So here's Rose. I apologize that the quality's not the best. I couldn't download a better quality for the video. But right here, we have all the stuff that happened in Resident Evil Village with Ethan's sacrifice. So we have Rose right here. So Rose is the main character, obviously, of this DLC. Now, I'm not too sure what that's about right there. It reminds me of the Evil Within 2, where in the beginning of the game, Sebastian enters STEM, and to create an almost parallel scenario to him entering STEM, they have it where he's falling through water, and he just emerges from it, so it's probably the same case here. Because this DLC, it did mention that the Megamycete is returning here, and Rose is entering the consciousness of the Megamycete, but more on that later.
I can show you things even Chris doesn't know I can do. I want to live a normal life.
Yeah, see, I want to live a normal life. So that's apparently what this DLC is about. So this right here is very odd. So apparently we're gonna be going back to previous areas, and that just seems very lazy to me. Like, I expected new areas for this DLC, similar to the Not a Hero DLC and the End of Zoe DLC. We went to brand new areas in those DLCs for Resident Evil 7, and it was a fresh take, and it complemented the whole idea of the DLC experiences showcasing new characters feeling very different to the experience Ethan Winters went through. But it seems like they're taking the easy way out with this DLC. So I feel like this DLC is going to be more so reskinned areas. Like, they're going to be reusing a lot of assets from Resident Evil Village rather than creating new areas. I mean, the DLC does showcase some new areas, but I feel like most of this is just going to be retreading through old areas. And this was surprising that we got this. And in fact, why is this even here? This is confusing, but I'll express this a little bit more later on. Okay, so based on this dialogue that's being shown here, Rose, we know that she has her abilities. I mean, I assume she was born with the abilities, not that Miranda actually gave her the abilities, because of course, how would she be a compatible vessel for Rose if Miranda just simply infected her somehow? And like, we know that in Resident Evil Village, in Eugene's diary, it mentions that Rose was crystallized and separated into the four pieces that became the four flasks that each of the lords have. But I think Rose already had her abilities, but if that's the case, why is it that the BSAA never detected her abilities? I mean, in a file in Ethan's home, where it talks about the analysis done on Rose to make sure that she wasn't infected by the mutamycete that Evelyn had. It didn't note anything. I mean, it said that additional fungal pathogen tests will be done by the BSAA, but that was really it. So, what are we assuming here? That Rose actually had her abilities at birth, or that Miranda actually infected Rose the moment she was captured, and like Rose initially didn't have any of her abilities? And for some reason, they use the term powers in this trailer. I really don't like that because powers is a fantasy term. Powers is not a term that you use in science fiction and the like. They should be using more scientifically grounded terminology, not powers. That just seems really dumb. And I think I used powers just then, so that was a big mistake on my part for saying that. But that's another big problem I have with this DLC. It feels like it's more so like fantasy-esque, more so than science fiction-esque. And I understand that Resident Evil 7 and Village touched upon the psychological horror aspects, but they at least had a biological basis for this. But even despite the biological basis for why Rose is entering the consciousness of the Megamycete, just the way it's presented, some of the iconography feels like the kind of iconography you'd see in fiction and fantasy rather than in science fiction, and I feel like they're going a little over the top with the interpretation of this. So something moved on her hand, so I'm guessing what, like Rose is struggling with her abilities or something? It's confusing. And at least this DLC confirms one thing, and it's that the flasks that Rose was contained in, for some reason on the flasks, there was some writing that mentioned like treatments and like the treatments of the subjects are needed to control like cell growth or something like similar to Evelyn. Like it feels like the flasks that were utilized in Resident Evil Village were just reused assets from Resident Evil 7, like some early build of Resident Evil 7. Which is why, despite the fact that the writing on the flasks indicate that Rose has very similar levels of instability compared to Evelyn, it's not actually true. It's just they forgot to update the text properly, because they didn't expect fans to pay attention to that, and it's fucking stupid. But this at least confirms that 16 years passed, because it wouldn't make sense for just a short amount of time to pass, but Rose had the same trouble as Evelyn, where her cells were abnormally dividing like crazy because of chromosomal abnormalities. So obviously it makes sense that it's 16 years after that, but like the 16-year thing doesn't sit right with me, but I'll explain later.
Shut up.
I understand the feeling, Rose. You know, the idea that you have these nagging, intrusive thoughts just constantly plaguing your mind, and that's why you're saying shut up. I love this music in the trailer, by the way. This is one of the few things I like.
What's going on?
So she doesn't understand what's happening inside this world here. Now, this right here, leave now. So it's mentioned later on that someone named Michael is leaving these messages. Go while you can. Yeah, so it's clear Michael wants Rose to get out of there.
Just like...
Now, see, this right here, this is one of the things that really didn't sit right for me, and it really complemented the whole idea that new Capcom is reusing a lot of assets from previous Resident Evil games and also from Resident Evil Village. But this whole idea of Rose encountering a duplicate of herself, like some kind of doppelganger, this similar concept in some kind of psychological plane, and the idea of having a doppelganger, this was actually used in the Little Miss DLC for Revelations 2. And you know how I mentioned before that Resident Evil Village, like there were some initial discussions that this was actually Revelations 3 before it became Resident Evil Village, but like Pulkit Sharma disagreed with me on that, and he said that those rumors weren't actually true. Well, this is honestly supporting the already invalidated rumor that Resident Evil Village was originally Revelations 3, but because it's clear that they're borrowing ideas from Revelations 2 with the Little Miss DLC. And I've never played the Little Miss DLC, but I never touched it because I didn't like the concept of it, how you're just playing as Natalia and your partner is Dark Natalia, and you're just sneaking through areas, and once you figure out the path, there's no real replayability to it. Maybe it's different, because I don't know. But it didn't really serve that much of a purpose with adding a new perspective to the story of Revelations 2, I feel. Maybe if I played the DLC, I understand, but I don't know what this is going to do. I don't know what they're trying to go for this. Like, is this meant to be Evelyn right here on the left? Is this meant to be... Because remember, like, Miranda said to Ethan the first time he met her after defeating Heisenberg. Like, Miranda said to Ethan that Rose is Evelyn's true successor. No, Rose is Evelyn. And see, that statement was very, very confusing because the vagueness of the details provided by Miranda made it seem like Rose was actually Evelyn reborn. So really, Ethan and Mia didn't give birth to Rose; they gave birth to Evelyn. But rather, I thought it was like Evelyn didn't have very good control of her abilities, so like Rose is the true successor to Evelyn in the sense that she has better control of her abilities. But it totally feels like new Capcom is trying to complement the former case where it seems like Rose is Evelyn, or maybe like there's some part of Evelyn within her. Like, if you remember in the epilogue of Resident Evil Village, there was that one agent who joked about Rose by calling her Evelyn, and I don't know why he joked about it because that's very insensitive and very cold and really evil of him to do that. I mean, my blind playthrough reaction to that should definitely warrant that. But I don't know if they're trying to go for that, but that would just seem like a very silly idea to me for a DLC content. And like I said before, this feels like it's reusing assets from Revelations 2. I feel like this DLC is going to be nothing but reused assets and reused ideas. Considering that it's 16 years after the events of Resident Evil Village, why the hell would you do a time jump of that many years but preserve it for a DLC? A time jump of 16 years. Like, that amount of years that have passed, that should warrant a new game, not some DLC content. And it totally feels like they're just trying to conclude the Winter Seas arc, like the whole Winter's family arc, just like rapidly so that they can focus on other characters because a lot of people just want the Winter Seas family storyline to be done, which is fucking retarded if you ask me. The insecurities of the fans, new Capcom is mirroring those kind of insecurities. And not just in this content, but in other content that they've introduced with this DLC. Now, this part doesn't make any sense right here. I don't know why the Duke is here, but I feel like they're trying to build off of early concept art for Resident Evil Village, where like they had this early idea to make the Duke the final boss of the game, and that he was actually meant to be the Fifth Lord. But they didn't actually go through with that with Resident Evil Village's final product. So I'm guessing they're trying to pay off that whole idea of the Duke being evil, but he's instead some kind of psychological entity, basically. Is that how you're supposed to interpret it? Because like this whole entire place is meant to be like an experience taking place within the consciousness of the Mega Mycete. So what are we assuming here? That the Duke was somehow registered into the Mega Mycete's consciousness? And this trailer and also the commentary that new Capcom provided for summarizing what this DLC is, it doesn't properly explain what the Mega Mycete is. We know it's a parasitic colony that, that's really it though. We don't know if the actual Megamycete is just the mold sprouting from this parasitic colony, or if the Megamycete is the parasites itself. And I mean, the whole idea of the Megamycete containing the consciousness of the individuals and animals it has come into contact with and storing that genetic data, I assume it's meant to mirror the whole idea of hyphae in fungi, where they actually have the ability to transmit electric signals when they're like consuming like biomass or consuming some kind of nutrients. I mean, scientists haven't confirmed whether this is some form of communication or it's just simply like nothing but electrical signals. But it feels like the Megamycete is trying to build off of this whole idea. This is something I make note of in my review that I'm doing right now. And speaking of which, I have done at least 90 pages for my review for Resident Evil Village, but given that this DLC is releasing, there are definitely going to be some new details to add to that review, because I was designing the review not knowing what the DLC was. But now that this DLC has been revealed, there are definitely some new details to add to my review. But it's clear right here the Duke is meant to be the villain in this case, just to pay off to the early storyboard concept of having the Duke be the Fifth Lord and having him be the actual final boss of the game. And maybe this is what they're trying to do right here. And he's wearing a mask right here. I don't know what the mask means. I don't know what that means in plays or in opera. I don't know what the symbolic meaning of that is. But we also have some new enemies here. So these, I think these enemies are meant to be reskins of the Moriekas because I noticed later on that a lot of their animations look very similar to the Morieka. Yeah, so the experience is definitely overwhelming for Rose. And wow, 16 years and she's still being plagued by a lot of these intrusive thoughts. That definitely says a lot about Rose's lack of experience with understanding her abilities. But the thing is that the whole premise of this DLC seems to be Rose trying to get rid of her abilities. But that right there just completely invalidates the whole idea of even having Rose being given her abilities to begin with. It almost feels like they could have told this DLC if they set up in Resident Evil Village that Rose was not infected by the Megamycete initially, or like she wasn't infected by Evelyn's like Mutamycete. Like it's completely throwing away like the whole setup of even giving Rose her abilities. It's just why would you introduce Rose as having her abilities in the main game of Resident Evil Village if in the DLC you're just going to be like, no, don't focus on that. We'll just be getting rid of them. It's something that really feels like a menagerie of idiocy, if you ask me. It just feels like a very idiotic form of storytelling. Like, why introduce this whole idea if you're then going to throw it away in, like, the next piece of content? Similar to how in Assassin's Creed Origins, they introduced the Leap of Faith, they showed the origin of it, but then in the very next game, they completely violate the lore that they established about the Leap of Faith in Assassin's Creed Origins. It's like that. It completely invalidates the need for Rose to have her abilities if she's then going to get rid of them in this DLC. So that right there is not good payoff at all. So that's the end of this. And then we have this, which I don't give a fuck about this. I mean, I've already acknowledged how shit the Mercenaries mode is. But not only do I not care about this, but there are some additional mechanics that are being introduced in this new content for the Mercenaries mode that, for some reason, Ethan didn't have at all during his time in Resident Evil Village and in the Mercenaries mode. So we're being introduced to new characters, new playable characters, so we can play as Chris Redfield, Heisenberg, and Lady Dimitrescu. And they have all these new fundamental mechanics to them that is meant to somehow flesh out the whole experience of Mercenaries. You're even getting new maps as well, but the gameplay in Resident Evil Village is already severely compromised and so bare bones and so basic that no matter what you do, you're still going to end up with the same mind-numbing, boring gameplay. If you see my live stream of the Mercenaries mode for Resident Evil Village, I'm sure this extra content is going to mirror the same exact feelings I had about the Mercenaries mode and just the overall gameplay flow of Mercenaries overall. What we see right here, we can play as Chris Redfield. He has his assault rifle, and this right here is interesting. So it seems like they're reintroducing the ability to do context-sensitive melee attacks. Although I don't really know how this works. Like, you see, that Lycan went into a stun animation, and is this supposed to be like an animation that you can punish? Like, you can punish this flinch animation with an animation, or is Chris swapping to his fist? Like, is he actually is this guy pressing like the D-pad to swap to the fist, and then like that's what's allowing Chris to punch him? Or is this some kind of ability that you can unlock when you get a skill? Like, why would they introduce this kind of fundamental mechanic that should have been something introduced in the fundamental gameplay of Resident Evil Village? It doesn't make any fucking sense. And we know that Ethan Winters was supposedly undergoing military training before the events of Resident Evil Village, yet his fighting capabilities are so inferior to how he was in Resident Evil 7. And that should have been the perfect time for them to introduce the whole idea of punishing flinch animations with an animation, with a context-sensitive melee attack, and that could have easily balanced out a lot of encounters, and maybe warranted a lot of the enemy placements that honestly, at this point in Resident Evil Village, they feel so negligible at best. There are so many negligible enemy placements that feel so much better to run past, rather than actually deal with them. And that's when you realize you're playing a game. That's when you realize how little the developers comprehended their own designs. Like, the inclusion of this kind of mechanic in the main experience of Resident Evil Village would have added a bit more depth to the gameplay, but it's almost like right here, the developers are not expressing any love for Ethan. They're not expressing any kind of care for Ethan. They're giving these other characters these kind of capabilities and these kind of fundamental mechanics that should have been ingrained into the actual design philosophy of the fundamental gameplay of Resident Evil Village for Ethan Winters, if he supposedly went through military training. Like, they marketed Resident Evil Village as Ethan Winters' personal journey. But right here, just the way they give these other characters these kind of capabilities that honestly should have been needed to make the gameplay better for Resident Evil Village and maybe warrant a lot of the other designs, like complement the other designs put in place for Resident Evil Village. This comes across as insulting to Ethan Winters. It really does. That's what I meant when I said I watched this, and it came across as very offensive and insulting to me personally and to Ethan Winters. But you see right here the context sensitive melee, or like the fist that he's actually equipped via the D-pad, or maybe this kind of skill that he got from knifing those blue circles or whatever. Like, this is what's allowing him to do these kind of punch attacks. I'm not too sure what this is about. I don't know what to think of this. Is this actually them tweaking the gameplay to introduce the ability to punish flinch animations with an animation similar to Resident Evil 4, 5, 6, and the Not a Hero DLC from 7? Or is he just swapping to a different weapon? Because then it just... If it's not that, if it's not like... a tweak to the fundamental gameplay to introduce the same gameplay aspect from Resident Evil 4, 5, 6, and 7, and instead it's just him swapping to his fists, and the fists just have this base capability. That right there is pretty stupid. But either way, regardless of what path you take, this is very offensive. It doesn't change what this mode is. This mode is so mindless compared to the Mercenaries mode we've had previously. And Mercenaries mode, in all honesty, wasn't even that good. I mean, I know I acknowledged before that I like Resident Evil 6's Mercenaries mode because it showcases the complexities of the combat. It allows you to be experimental with the combat and deal with so many enemies, but it gets very repetitive after a while. And the same repetitive nature is here, but it's worse compared to Resident Evil 6 and worse than Resident Evil 5. Like, it's not good. I don't feel the need to validate new Capcom's new ideas for what they define as a cool extra game mode. And just because you give us these other characters to play as doesn't mean I'm going to be invested in it, because it doesn't matter what you do. Like, you can have a raw chicken, you can season it and just garnish it with whatever you want. Like, you had all these, like, 4 different raw chicken, right? And they each have their own garnishes, this and that, but it still doesn't change the fact that it's raw chicken, and if you eat it, you are going to get sick and possibly die. The raw chicken is the Mercenaries mode. The garnish and the seasoning is just the characters and their capabilities. It still doesn't change what the Mercenaries mode is. A very boring, mind-numbing, repetitive, dragged out, like, one-sided experience that honestly feels better to do in one specific way. It's not flexible in the slightest. It's not imaginative. It's just a boring extra game mode that honestly feels on par with how boring the Ghost Survivors DLC was for Resident Evil 2 Remake, or like the Fourth Survivor, or the Tofu Survivor DLC.
Marking the target.
So we have the ability to use the laser pointer here, nothing that special. And we also have the new maps as well. So you see right here, this is outside of Moreau's Windmill. So this is right by the door that leads to the Magnum, which not really that interesting of a new area. I mean, what happened to that? Like, why is it that they're not doing the same thing that they did with Resident Evil 5 and 6, where in the Mercenaries mode for those games, the maps were entirely different. Like, there were certain maps that were completely unique from the actual main experience of those games. Like, Resident Evil 6 had so many unique maps that didn't reuse a lot of the assets. Like, they weren't, like, areas you visited in the main game, just reskinned to be the Mercenaries maps. They were entirely new in their layouts, but it's not the same case here, which is pretty lazy. But we have Chris Redfield, then we have Heisenberg right here. So Heisenberg has the ability to summon Soldat Jets, and the Soldat Jets then do their ability where they use a laser-guided system to propel themselves towards you in order to stab you. So it seems like it's the same case here. And then we have Dimitrescu. So like, they're only using Heisenberg and Dimitrescu because those are the most popular characters. So it's clear that Moreau and Beneviento once again get the short end of the sticks. And like, Moreau and Beneviento overall just feel like last-minute additions to Resident Evil Village, and this whole idea that they're not even included in the Mercenaries mode just complements the whole idea that New Capcom didn't have any plans for them originally in the early design stages of Resident Evil Village, and they just introduced Moreau and Beneviento simply because they felt they didn't have enough villains. That's what it came across to me, and I make note of this in my review, so stay tuned for that. But you think this is honestly going to impress me? I mean, they're obviously building upon a lot of the fan art and a lot of the, like, sexual love people have towards Alcina Dimitrescu, and because they're giving players the ability to play as her, that's what's actually moderating and actually strengthening the feelings people have for her, but because they're actually playing as her. That's what they're trying to do right here. And you have this right here. So she actually throws her dresser, like she throws the mirror, like she threw the dresser slash mirror in that cutscene in Resident Evil Village, and they made that an ability now just for comic relief.
What next?
And now this right here is yet again another example of context-sensitive animation. So it seems like Alcina has the ability to grab enemies and slam it into the ground and do some kind of canned animation similar to what the Lycans do when they grab you, or what the Moriekas do when they grab you, and they go into that cammed animation, that very cinematic animation. So I don't know how this is going to work, but maybe it's going to be tied to the player swapping to her hands. And that is what will allow her to grab onto enemies. Like, is she even going to be able to use weapons? Not that I even care. But that's done. But we skip on to this, and this right here is another insulting piece of content. This right here is the third-person perspective for Ethan Winters in the main game of Resident Evil Village. So, compared to the likes of the Evil Within 2, this is way more offensive. Evil Within 2, like, they're trying to do the same thing like that John Johannes did for the Evil Within 2, because in the Evil Within 2, they eventually added an update where you could play the game in first person. And it wasn't so offensive, because I feel like the Evil Within, because it doesn't have a lengthy history compared to Resident Evil to the Resident Evil series. That's why this change in perspective it was okay in the Evil Within 2. And it didn't feel like you were taking away who Sebastian was. But the thing with Ethan Winters is the first-person perspective and the idea that you're so close to the environment and his hands are what guide you through the experience. Like, the emotions displayed by his hands. Like, the first-person perspective provides a level of mystique to Ethan Winters. And it's almost like a new Capcom is completely invalidating or throwing away a lot of the general foundations that make up Ethan Winters' character by giving them the third-person perspective. And this is once again building off the whole idea of insecurities, because so many people don't like Resident Evil 7 and Village because of the first-person perspective. Why? Why is it that there are people that are so insecure about a Resident Evil game and they just feel like camera perspective is what dictates what a Resident Evil game is? Like, there are these insecure people that feel like the Resident Evil as a game series only works in the third-person perspective, and new Capcom is trying to validate those people, similar to how they tried to validate the knife-only people by putting in that Knives Out challenge just for the sake of it, without any kind of thought. It's such an esoteric challenge. It's not even a challenge, it's just a what the fuck are you doing moment. Like, it mirrors the very same stupidity as the Knives Out challenge in Resident Evil Village, where they just simply introduced it for the sake of it, and it's just doing it here. Like, they're only putting it here just to shut the people up who say that they don't like Resident Evil 7 or Village being first person. They just want it to be third person because that's what allows them to connect with characters. That just goes to show how narrow-minded these people are. I have more connection with Ethan Winters just with a pair of hands than I do with the characters in Resident Evil 2 Remake and Resident Evil 3 Remake, or in most other Resident Evil games. Like, it's not so simple with the whole idea of the first-person perspective. Like, the first-person perspective governs so many other principles. The first-person perspective adds mystique to Ethan's character. The first-person perspective allows you to be more connected to the world. Everything is close up to you. And, like, the first-person perspective is such a defining trait of Ethan Winters. I didn't need to see his face. Like, I saw his face before in some kind of concept art. I saw his face, like, made by fans and the like. And, you know, like, I'm glad with it being there, but I don't want it in the game. And that's just what it feels like. It feels like they're doing it for fan service because so many people asked for it, because so many people whined and complained about this game not being third person, that new Capcom caved into their demands, and that's why they're doing this. In fact, I just wonder, will certain mechanics work differently in the third-person mode? Like, maybe in the process of designing the third-person mode, new Capcom screwed up some other mechanics as well. Maybe that's what they did. And maybe this, I mean, that definitely leaves an interesting possibility that the third-person perspective might change up the gameplay a bit, but it still doesn't change the fact that it just seems like they're doing it just to shut up the people who whine and complain all the time about this game not being third-person. And they completely, like, invalidate a lot of the principles that are established with the first-person perspective in Resident Evil 7 and Village. Like, people are so fucking retarded as to think that perspective is what dictates gameplay, perspective is what dictates a game series, and perspective is little more than that, perspective, when there's so much more depth to what perspective is if developers go out of their way to establish it. Like, in a lot of the developer interviews for Resident Evil 7 and Village, they specified a lot of the principles and a lot of the beliefs they had when implementing the first-person perspective. But it's like they're going back on those designs. It's like they're saying, oh, we were wrong back then, let's just actually cave into the insecurities of fans because they're the ones who are actually correct, not us. That's how insulting this is. It really is. So we see some gameplay here. So it looks like the gameplay is going to be very similar to Resident Evil 2. Like they're even reusing a lot of the same animations from Resident Evil 2 Remake. Like, they couldn't even bother making the animations look slightly different or anything. And also, why is Ethan holding his gun upward? In the gameplay, when he's holding his pistol, he holds it to the side, like right in front of his stomach. So why is he holding it up? Like, why did they change that? That just seems kind of odd. Maybe it just looked weird in third person, but... You know, like, it's probably going to feel like a rehashing of designs in Resident Evil 2 Remake. And also, how will crouching work? How will a lot of these mechanics that worked better in the first-person mode now work in the third-person mode? Will crouching even be a thing? Will they allow you to crouch under attacks? Like, will those mechanics be compromised in the third-person mode? Like, this is why I'm not a fan of this mode. Like, this is another reason why I'm not a big fan of this mode. A lot of the impact these sequences had felt more powerful in first-person mode than in here. And like I said, there's principles involved. There's principles and design put in place with the first-person perspective that define Ethan Winters as a character. That it defines those games. It defines Resident Evil 7, and it defines Resident Evil Village on a certain aspect. But to throw those away is just so insulting and offensive. And we have right here, so, like, Ethan pulls the shotgun off his back in the third-person mod. It's... You know, how will the counter system work, I wonder? You know, like, the counter that you can do against the Lycans, where you shoot them in the head, and then they launch towards you, and then you push them back and kick them away. How will that look in the third-person perspective? I wonder if New Capcom is even aware that that mechanic exists, because based on how improperly designed that mechanic was, it's almost like New Capcom didn't even know that mechanic was still around. So I wonder if they even realize that mechanic is still there. It's probably going to look stupid, but we'll have to see in a moment. Yeah, and that's all there is to showcase right there. And this is the commentary that they provided for this DLC.
Three major features. First, the third-person mode. Many people asked for this.
You say asked for this, they whined about it, and you caved into their demands, rather than actually resting on your laurels, rather than actually putting trust in yourself. Like, this third-person mod is the kind of thing a developer would do if they were not self-confident, if they had no sense of confidence or courage within themselves. Like, just caved into to people's demands because that's what actually governs this game, apparently.
And we were able to add it into the game. Now, you'll be able to see Ethan as he desperately fights for...
And, like, how will blocking work as well? How can you possibly judge whether you're facing an enemy correctly? How can you judge that the hitbox is going to be registered correctly in the third-person mod? Or they're going to have to change a lot of the mechanics, it feels like, with this third-person mod. And, like, the thing with the Evil Within 2 is with the first-person mod, a lot of the mechanics didn't really change. I mean, they changed certain mechanics. Like, you actually didn't do an animation for picking up healing items. It just teleported into your inventory. And it's the same with green gel. And also, like, with the stomp animation, it reverted to third person, and there was only one stomp animation. There weren't multiple stomp animations in the first-person mod for the Evil Within 2 with what they designed. Like, it's... I don't think this mode is going to be that good. I mean, I'm going to do this for a walkthrough, definitely, and, like, I need to actually play this DLC myself and do, like, a walkthrough for it to better understand it and to convey my thoughts correctly. But I doubt I'll be excited for this.
Survival. Players that have already experienced Ethan's journey can enjoy the new perspective and animations, too. The Mercenaries returns with additional orders in an arcade-style action game where focus has been put on the exhilarating feeling...
Exhilarating feeling! Exhilarating feeling. Are you about as dense as all these other people that just like to drag out scenarios, that just are so content with just... like, hitting one button over and over again? Like, it's just... like, the whole exhilarating feel could honestly be on par with that of mashing one button repeatedly in a game, and it just leads to a very stagnant mess. Like, if you can't feel the same feelings I had towards the Mercenaries mode in the live streams, that is just so wrong on so many levels. How can they say exhilarating feeling? How can they think that mindlessly mowing down enemies and just slotting into upgrades and the like, just taking this one specific path is somehow exhilarating? And they don't even bother putting in a good combat system to complement the exhilarating feeling of the Mercenaries mode. Like, what is this appealing to? Bloodthirsty individuals? Those who are on a bloodlust? Like, horny two-year-olds? Like, what the fuck is this? This is such bad messaging right here with the exhilarating feeling. It's just such paid advertising right there, conveying, like, such false messaging.
Of defeating relentless hordes of enemies. New stages are included.
Yeah, new stages that are just reused from the main game.
As well as additional playable characters, such as Chris Redfield and Heisenberg. Of course,
Of course, they had to phrase it like that. Of course, Lady Dimitrescu will be there too, because they wanted to personally acknowledge all the horny fans that love Alcina Dimitrescu. Wow. That kind of messaging is the same kind of messaging you'd see in Resident Evil 2 Remake's marketing. It's coming back! That cringy marketing, or like the live-action trailer that they did for Resident Evil 2 Remake that was so cringe, and just cheesy, and just comedic. What were they trying to do with that? Or like with the puppet show for Resident Evil Village. Why would they do a puppet show as a form of marketing? Why would they waste money on that? Why would they try to take away from the seriousness of this game? That's so fucking stupid.
Dimitrescu will be there too. We've really fueled this mode up.
Shut up. Fueled this mode up. You don't even know what that means, do you? You completely blurred the line between just a mindless slog and supposedly fueling the mode up. Wow. You guys are so fucking delusional if you think that. I mean, I've already acknowledged that the Resident Evil Village team is the dumbest development team ever for a Resident Evil game, and I've just talked ad nauseum about this point so much, but blurring the line like that with their choice of words, I mean, then again, this could be a marketing guy, because, like, a lot of times people in marketing, they tend to say things incorrectly, or they, like for instance, in marketing for Project Resistance, they said that the Las Plagas is related to the NA-alpha parasite. Even the Resident Evil podcast team felt the same, that maybe it was just some marketing guy just adding that in just because, not because New Capcom understands, or not because like Capcom in general understands that. They just said it just because they misunderstood the lore properly. Maybe this is just a misunderstanding right here, but this is just fucking stupid.
Enjoy looking down on your foes from over 9 feet above.
I'm not even gonna bother just dwelling on that. That's fucking stupid.
The third edition is one you've surely been waiting
Now,
for.
this is where I need to talk a lot about the Shadows of Rose
Let me
DLC.
introduce just a bit of this story.
Rose, the beloved daughter of the main protagonist Ethan, is now a grown-up main character.
Yeah, now a grown-up main character. So, this is something I don't understand as well. Like, why do they have to do such a time jump? A time jump like this doesn't make any sense because they established in Resident Evil Village that the BSAA is evil. And having a time jump of 16 years just invalidates the whole idea of the BSAA being evil. Because why would they still be evil after 16 years? It makes no sense. It makes zero sense. And in a discussion I had with Lauren Kane about this, like there are a couple of things that I needed to discuss about this. Like Lauren Kane mentioned for the Shadows of Rose DLC, I mean, like she is excited to see Rosemary back, and I do agree with the idea of seeing Rosemary, but she should have been reserved for Resident Evil 9 if they're going to be doing this kind of time jump. I mentioned to Lauren Kane, I honestly thought they would reserve Rose for Resident Evil 9. I thought the DLC would focus more on Chris or the history of the village. A time jump of 16 years feels better reserved for a new game, not a DLC. Also, the whole premise of Shadows of Rose is Rose trying to remove her powers. But if that's the case, why do you bother giving her those abilities in the first place? Like, there's a lot that doesn't make any sense right here, and just a lot of invalidation of ideas that they set up in Resident Evil Village by doing this massive time jump. It makes no sense.
In this new story mode. In this sequel to the main story of Village, you can experience Rose's struggles with the terrifying powers.
Well, don't say powers! Say powers in some fantasy game. This is a science fiction game. Like, this is something I don't understand. Like, just when they're using such terminology like this, like, at times they use such terminology with Resident Evil 7 and Village. I mean, mainly with Village more so than Resident Evil 7. But why do they use such terminology? It's off-putting to any true Resident Evil player. It's so stupid. Use abilities. Use some kind of biological process. Like, use a more grounded terminology that doesn't feel so over the top like this. Powers? What the fuck?
She was born with.
And this right here, this is the Megamycete. So this is yet another problem I have. Like, this is the most insulting part of this whole DLC with the Megamycete returning. So can you remember how in the Star Wars sequels with episode 7, 8, and 9, specifically with episode 9, they brought back Palpatine, and a lot of fans were so insulted by that because it completely invalidates Darth Vader's sacrifice, like his changing from a villain to a hero, to a good guy by actually sacrificing himself to take down Palpatine in episode 6, but it's all completely invalidated by Palpatine's return in episode 9. This is the same case right here. So apparently, Ethan's sacrifice means nothing. His sacrifice meant nothing, so he didn't destroy the Megamycete. The Megamycete is back right here. That right there is so insulting to Ethan Winters as a whole. Like, Ethan Winters was already done poorly in, like, certain parts with him being made out of the mold, for instance, and with him being made out of the mold, you have to assume that, oh, Ethan got out of the Baker estate because Evelyn was an idiot and didn't bother actually using her ability and control over the mold to, like, paralyze Ethan or anything, like she demonstrated with Zoe, or, for instance, with that one worker in, the tanker, or also with Alan. She just forgot to use her ability, so Ethan only managed to escape the Baker estate because Evelyn was an idiot. That's what you're sending with that. That's what you're sending to people who love Ethan Winters, who felt like they could relate to him because he wasn't infected. He was a seemingly normal individual with no fighting experience, but with him being made out of the mold, just out of the blue, and they haven't even explained it. This is another thing as well. Like, they killed off Ethan Winters so that they didn't have to explain his abilities in the new games. Because his abilities make no sense in Resident Evil 7 and Village. I mean, in Resident Evil 7 you can understand because he was infected by the mold, and maybe in Resident Evil Village, if they actually stuck to the whole idea of Ethan being normal, they could have said that the BSAA cured them. I mean, they developed the cure to the E-type Euthymycete in the end of Zoe DLC. They cured Zoe. But apparently, like, there are people on the Wikipedia, like the official Resident Evil Wikipedia. Like, I updated the Wikipedia to mention that it doesn't make any sense for Ethan to be made out of the mold, and why wasn't he cured by the BSAA? But then someone reverted those changes, and they're like, oh, the cure doesn't cure mutants. Yet has that fucking idiot not played the End of Zoe DLC and realized that Zoe was cured by the cure and she was infected longer than Ethan? So why would it be so different with Ethan? Why is he the mutant and not Zoe? What idiots are running the Resident Evil wiki right now? The guy's name is Forerunner, and he's so stupid. Really, I mean, I think his name is Forerunner, but I don't know. I'm not gonna dwell on that. But overall, like, why would they introduce the Megamycete here? Why would they introduce the Megamycete here just so they can conclude the mold storylines that they didn't have to explore? Like, that's probably what they're doing. They're probably trying to just rush the Winterseas family's storyline with this DLC so that they don't have to focus on the mold, the Mutamycete, or the Megamycete in future releases. That's what they're doing right here. That's probably what they're doing. Not that they really needed to do so, because Revelations 2, they introduced the T-Phobos virus, but they haven't bothered to touch upon that whatsoever. We don't even know what happened with Natalia. We know that, like, some remnant of Alex Wesker seemed to be manifesting inside of her, but we never saw that at all in the later games. So why do they even need to go through with this? They could just forget about the mold, Mutamycete, and Megamycete entirely after Resident Evil Village. Why do they need to go through this process where they can just abruptly conclude it? Like, what's the point of this? And like I said, the insult to Ethan Winters and making his sacrifice feel, like, completely irrelevant and not having any value to it because the Megamycete is still around right here. Why does she even have the Megamycete here? Is this because this is Blue Umbrella? Like, is this Blue Umbrella or the BSAA? Like, they actually managed to get the Megamycete? Because we know that the BSAA, being evil in Resident Evil Village, they were trying to gain access to the Megamycete. And we know that Chris, in the ending of Resident Evil Village, he plotted the course for BSAA Europe HQ. And he knew that the BSAA was sending in bioweapons, like BOWs, in place of actual soldiers to recover the Megamycete. So what, is it building off of that? So the BSAA is still evil after 16 years? What the fuck is... How does that make any sense? How does that make any sense? I don't understand that at all. It's so abrupt. There's no setup to the whole idea of the BSAA being evil, and they're still evil after 16 years? How are they still around? It doesn't make sense!
To break free of the curse of her powers, she entered.
Curse! Stop using such fantasy terms like that. Curse! Curse? This person who's doing the marketing doesn't understand good terminology in a grounded science fiction game.
The consciousness of the Megamycete.
So like it's pretty much them copying the evil within, pretty much. It's almost like the Megamycete is acting like STEM, and then the way Rose is transitioning into the consciousness mirrors what Sebastian went through when he plugged into STEM the first time in The Evil Within 2, with him falling through that water, and then he emerges, and he's falling, and he's standing on water when he lands. They're using the same water motif right here. And then this... She meets a girl who looks just like her, and this girl was actually in the concept art. If you go to the concept art at Resident Evil Village, it's just like that. This girl looks exactly like that girl in the concept art. And like the pale colors that she's expressing right now is meant to represent Evelyn in some ways. It's meant to borrow certain elements of Evelyn and implement that into her her character and her design and the way she looks. But this has to be Evelyn. It has to be. Who else could it be? Why would this dark version of Rose be here? Why would this dark version of Rose be here? Because we know, based on Mother Miranda, she said that Rose is Evelyn, if we're to believe her words at face value, or maybe she's just terrible at explaining it to Ethan, and so we have to interpret it from an abstract perspective.
The girl who looks just like her. In this mysterious realm of consciousness, time and space is...
I feel like with The Evil Within, the whole idea of a realm of conscious, like the whole idea of the collective consciousness of individuals actually forming the basis for STEM, like in the world that you're in, Evil Within managed to do what any generic supernatural game would do when creating a world like this, and they made it feel grounded in science. They made it feel grounded in psychology. The way they implemented science and psychology into the basis for the environmental storytelling and also for the basis of STEM, that is glorious. That is truly a unique IP right there. That is such a novel and unique design right there for The Evil Within. But it just feels like they're trying to copy that. Or maybe they're trying to copy elements of Revelations 2 with the whole idea of the psychological realm. And also, is this mysterious realm possibly tied to that realm that Ethan enters after he deals with Heisenberg? Like, you know how he's supposedly killed by Miranda, but then he's revived and he's speaking with Evelyn? Like, is Rose going to see younger Evelyn there? And is this doppelganger of Rose supposed to be the consciousness of Evelyn, but aging with time? And that would seem very odd for a consciousness to age. Why would a consciousness age? That's confusing. But just the ideas feel like they're borrowing ideas from other games and other Resident Evil games with Revelations 2, and I don't like this. And I feel like with the way it's presented, it feels a little too supernatural. And also, what's this whole lab that she's in? Is this meant to be like a lab similar to what we encountered in the Not a Hero DLC? In fact, is this actually the same lab? You know, now that I think about it, the format of this lab looks kind of similar. I mean, some of the desks look a little different, and some of the things on the desks are different from this piece of content to the Not a Hero DLC. Like, is this meant to be the Connections lab or something? Like, why does the Megamycete have all this? Like, what exactly is the Megamycete going to show Rose in this DLC? That's confusing, and we still don't know what exactly allows the consciousness to even manifest within the Megamycete. I mean, all we have to go on is that, oh, fungi use hyphae, and hyphae transmit electrical signals, and they're trying to use that as sort of a general basis for why the Megamycete is able to hold the consciousness of individuals, because assuming consciousness is like electrical signals, the Megamycete manages to incorporate the neuroelectric signals present within the brains of individuals and integrate it into its own. That's probably what it is.
Beyond recognition, Rose is guided by a being who calls himself Michael.
Now, is Michael supposed to be the guy that was with Rose when they were inspecting the Megamycete? And how is he communicating with Rose here? I mean, I know, like, Evil Within, for instance, had certain designs put in place within the world of STEM that allowed the outside source to communicate. And they had Kidman in the real world contacting Sebastian through a communicator. which was a cool way to ground the environment in The Evil Within 2 between the real world and the STEM world, and actually link the worlds together in a way that made sense. But here, it feels like they're doing Occam's Razor, but they're giving it more of a fantastical interpretation, kind of. So it seems like that's what they're doing with the whole writing on the walls, this and that.
Who might be of assistance with removing her powers.
See, again, they're removing her powers. Like, why do you bother introducing Rose's abilities in Resident Evil Village if you're then going to do away with them entirely? We never see Rose demonstrate her own abilities, and maybe they're only doing this because they don't have the time and budget to actually design animations that showcase Rose's abilities. They instead devoted all that limited time and budget into developing this, which is mostly reused assets, it seems. And it's probably going to be a short piece of content. It's probably going to be as short as the Little Miss DLC, for all I know. This is probably going to be like a 30-minute piece of content. But for a substantial character like Rose, for a DLC that's taking place 16 years after the events of Resident Evil Village, do you honestly think that warrants a 30-minute piece of content? Why? Why the fuck would you do that? This is something that should have been its own game, not a DLC. This is so poorly planned. They're just trying to rush ideas out the door because they want to be done with Resident Evil Village so that they could probably devote a lot of their time to other Resident Evil games. This is just a cheap shortcut, but taken to a new level, basically. That's what it feels like.
Shadows of Rose is set completely in...
Oh, wow. Yeah, the whiny, horny Resident Evil idiots who think that camera perspective dictates whether a game is Resident Evil or not. That's who they're designing this DLC for, with a third-person perspective. I'm specifically referring to New Capcom, because New Capcom apparently has no self-confidence in themselves. They don't try to rest on their laurels so much. They just try to make a lot of changes, similar to what Assassin's Creed Odyssey did with Ubisoft Quebec, just completely changing everything involving Assassin's Creed and just making Assassin's Creed Odyssey not about Assassin's Creed, just appealing to the superficial designs, appealing to idiotic Assassin's Creed players. They're really dropping the ball pretty much. It feels like they're shooting themselves in the foot with some of these designs that they put in place with the DLC, and it's pretty offensive and insulting.
a third-person perspective. In the realm of consciousness, you won't only face creatures, but the world itself seems to be attacking you.
Ah, please. World itself is attacking you. They're just going to use this as, like, environmental barricades or something. There's no way the world will attack you. Or maybe they're, oh, the floor is lava. Watch out. They're probably going to be like that. Because if the quality of this DLC is going to be on par or, like, proportionate to the level of laziness displayed with Resident Evil Village, then most likely it's going to be the case here. With the so-called world attacking you.
Enjoy the horror of the world itself being your greatest enemy.
Yeah, I already enjoyed that kind of horror with Evil Within, and it was done a million times better than this game.
How will Rose...
Now, this is something that's strange. Why does she have this flask? And which flask is this? I'm confused by this. Is this supposed to be, A025... Huh. That's puzzling. I don't know what this flask is, but it's clear this is one of the flasks that Miranda was using. But it's crystallized even more. That's odd. Is this a flask that she finds in the story? Like, in the actual consciousness of the Megamycete? Or is this in the real world? If this is in the consciousness of the Megamycete, that would maybe make sense. But, I don't know. I don't know what to think of that. Next thing you know, they're probably going to be like, oh, this is a flask containing a portion of Ethan. This contains his heart. The heart that Miranda extracted and crushed. Yeah, they'll probably use some kind of lazy way to bring in Ethan Winters into this, but maybe it's not so lazy. Maybe it'll be a heartfelt send-off to his character, and with him actually getting the chance to talk with Rose before he's eventually lost. But whether they do it right or not remains to be seen, but if they do it in some kind of silly way, like, for instance, with Cassandra finding her father in the first episode of the Fate of Atlantis DLC, and it's so stupid the way it's portrayed, it has no emotion to it, and everything else when it comes to the gameplay just brings down that scene in quality. If it's like that, then it's not going to be good. I don't know what to think of this scene. But... you know, like, Lauren Kane did say that she was kind of positive about the whole idea of Ethan possibly returning here. Maybe he'll appear in Shadows of Rose since he was infected by the E-type mutant Mycete. I don't know if the consciousness of Evelyn's E-type mutant Myseed is directly connected to the Mega Myseed, though. It seemed to be very separate from the Mega Myseed, and that's another thing as well. If the Mega Myseed was actually cut into pieces, and that's why we see it in that little flask, is it only going to have a certain proportion of consciousness to it, like a certain percentage of the consciousness within it, or is it going to have the full entire consciousness? Like maybe it has replicates. That leaves a lot to questions, basically. And that's it. And I just trimmed out the rest of it. Yeah, there's so much negativity I'm expressing with this DLC, and it's warranted because Resident Evil Village and its development team, they're filled with poorly communicated thoughts, just very confused mentalities. That's what this DLC is going to be, confused. I know it's going to be confused. Even the Resident Evil podcast team will feel the same. I just know it. But we've done that, and now we have Resident Evil 4 Remake. So these are some additional shots that they've shown for Resident Evil 4 Remake. I will say, it looks a little strange the way Leon's eyes are bagged. It's almost like he's tired. It's almost like he hasn't slept in days or something. That just looks a little goth, if you ask me. I don't know. He has such gloomy eyes. Maybe they should change his name from Babyface Leon to Gloomy-Eyed Leon or something.
Even for a second.
And then we get this shot of the village right here. So, yeah, this is the cutscene that plays when Leon is all like, where's everyone going? Bingo? Yeah, so, nice little detail right here.
Hi, everyone.
This is one thing I'm excited about with Resident Evil 4 Remake. So, Yasuhiro Ampo is the director of this game. And that makes me positive because Ampo-san was one of the directors for Resident Evil 5, and Resident Evil 5 is a really great game. It's one of the best Resident Evil games out there. It does co-op perfectly. It has the mechanics of Resident Evil 4. It has some improvements, but it does have some problems with its gameplay, and the bosses overall are pretty crap in Resident Evil 5. But Ampo-san knew what he was doing with Resident Evil 5, with the mechanics and with the scenarios, and a lot of the enemies didn't feel so throwaway. Like, they actually felt like they had a purpose. The scenarios actually felt believable. You're in the enemy's territory, so that's why they're going to be ambushing you. You didn't resort to mindlessly running past the enemies. You didn't resort to gaming the system. You actually trusted your mechanics. There were mechanics to trust. The game was not designed for merchant in mind, compared to Resident Evil Village. You could actually do Resident Evil 5 without ever having to use the store. You didn't have to get any resources, you didn't have to purchase tools, you didn't have to upgrade your resources. At baseline, Resident Evil 5 works as a Resident Evil game. It is beautiful. That is a survival horror game. I enjoy it. I'm confident that Ampo-san will actually guide the team in the correct direction, but let's hope he hasn't forgotten about what he did with Resident Evil 5.
Yasuhiro Anpo, director of Resident Evil 4.
And I'm Yoshiaki Hirabayashi.
I don't recognize Yoshiaki Hirabayashi. I don't recognize if he was in a previous game. I'll have to look up his credentials.
Producer of Resident Evil 4. This title is a reimagining of Resident Evil 4.
Yeah, we got that.
The original 2005 release.
And by the way, guys, Resident Evil 4 takes place in 2004, not 2005.
Similar to other titles in the series, we are carefully preserving what makes the original title special, while updating it with modern flourishes for everyone to enjoy when it launches in 2023.
My initial negativity towards Resident Evil 4 Remake is still there, but with Ampo-san, some of that is removed, but that remains to be seen because, you know, even though Morimasa Sato did the writing, like he was the lead writer for Resident Evil 7, he didn't understand his own lore when directing the team for Resident Evil Village. So it's clear that even though a developer or a director may have had past success with a previous game, don't always expect such past success to actually be mirrored in the new game.
Today, we'll reintroduce a bit of the game's story.
I am hopeful that this game will actually fix a lot of the story details with Resident Evil 4 because Shinji Mikami had admitted that the story of Resident Evil 4 was developed in the span of a fortnight because they ran out of time and they didn't have a lot of time to dedicate to the story, which is why the story is very simple and it has a bit of problems and it feels disconnected. But I imagine the new details they'll add to Resident Evil 4, like if they somehow link Umbrella to this, if we find some Umbrella facility, that will not make any sense at all. That'll be so out of the blue, and it'll present as such a massive continuity error. Because if we are assuming that the Any-Alpha parasites were derived from the Las Plagas, then most likely Umbrella had the Las Plagas with them, so why would they need to send Ada? Why would she even need to fool Wesker into giving him a Plaga sample? Like, what's the whole point of doing the bait and switch where she gives him a subordinate Plaga instead of a dominant Plaga if Wesker supposedly has Plagas in his grasp, assuming that the Any-Alpha parasite is related to the Las Plagas? It's details like that if they add, that's going to be fucking stupid. Because as the Resident Evil podcast team said, or like some member of the audience for the Resident Evil podcast team said, they said that a lot of the new directors for the newer Resident Evil games, they don't understand the lore properly for the previous games. That's precisely why Anthony Johnson, the lead writer for Resident Evil Village, clearly didn't understand the lore properly from Resident Evil 7 or the previous games when designing the lore for Resident Evil Village. And I don't understand why developers do this, where they hire people that have no basic understanding of the game series that they're writing for. But they're probably doing it just to save money for all I know. And if that's the case, then that's why the quality of Resident Evil Village was severely compromised.
Resident Evil 4 is set 6 years after the events in
Right.
Raccoon City, depicted in Resident Evil 2 and Resident Evil 3.
Which those games took place in 1998.
The main character of the game, Leon S. Kennedy, survived the Raccoon City incident and was assigned as an agent directly under the President of the United States.
I can't help but feel like they just simply looked at the intro for the original version of Resident Evil 4, and they're regurgitating that same information from the intro of Resident Evil 4. That's probably what they're doing.
Leon is dispatched to a quiet village in Europe as part of a mission to rescue the kidnapped daughter of the President. You might notice Leon is much more mature and fearless due to his past experiences.
Hey, the same thing I always say when survival horror characters should be evolving due to their past experiences. So it's clear that a new Capcom is actually synchronizing with my own beliefs as to what survival horror characters are supposed to do. They're supposed to evolve with the games. That's why Chris is as developed as he is in Resident Evil 5 and 6. That's why Jill is the way she is in Resident Evil 5. That's why other characters are better. Of course, in Resident Evil Village, they ruined Chris Redfield, which is fucking stupid, and he doesn't feel like the same character from Resident Evil 5 and 6. He doesn't feel like an evolution of the characters you see in Resident Evil 5 and 6. Or even 7, for that matter. So, yeah, to fuck that up is bad, but at least they have synchronized their own beliefs, my own beliefs, as to what survival horror characters should be doing. Maturing, and being a lot more fearless with their past experiences.
The Ganado, the main enemies...
Nice to see they actually use the term Ganado. It still makes me laugh to this day that in the official concept art for Resident Evil Village, they said that the Lycans are a more varied enemy than the Ganado and the Magini. Are they fucking retarded? Are they fucking dense? The Lycans are... You have only one variant to the Lycans. And when you get near the bow and arrow guys, they just become the normal Lycans, and you have the armored Lycans, but that's just two different variations to the Lycans! With the Ganados in Resident Evil 4, you had them using different weapons, you had the different factions. You had the Village Ganado, you had the Zealot Ganado, you had the Mercenary Ganado, you had the different enemy types, like for instance the Gatling Gunner, the Garrador, and also with like the Colmillos, and like, there's so many different variations to the enemies in Resident Evil 4. Same with Resident Evil 5, and they want to say the Lycans are more varied than the Ganado and the Magini in their official concept art for Resident Evil Village. Like, what crack have they been smoking? That is so delusional on so many levels.
of this game. Wait for him. The experience of being attacked by hordes of crazed Ganado is truly an iconic moment from Resident Evil.
Definitely.
In order to truly bring out the concept of terror of people controlled by madness, the Ganado have been completely redesigned.
Let's hope the lore makes a lot of sense, because if these Ganado act like the Magini from Resident Evil 5, or the Magini from Resident Evil Damnation, and they were a more evolved form of the Plaga, if the normal Plaga in Resident Evil 4, which were the original version of the Plaga, so they didn't have the same genetic manipulation done to them in Resident Evil 5 and Resident Evil Damnation, that is going to violate the lore significantly. So we know with the plagas in Resident Evil 4, originally they had to be injected into a host in an egg form, and then they had to mature, like they had to hatch from the egg, and then they had to mature into a plaga. And because of this slow, gradual process from going from an egg to a more mature adult, that's what allowed the host to fight off the control a little bit more. Whereas in Resident Evil 5 and Resident Evil Damnation, the Type 2 plagas developed by Tricell. I mean, the plagas in Resident Evil Damnation were different, but they had very similar characteristics to the plagas in Resident Evil 5, but because the mature plaga is able to insert another mature plaga directly into the individual via an oral infection, the control of the plaga was instant. There was no gradual process of assuming control like in Resident Evil 4. It was instant. And if the plagas in this game act like that, that is going to be wrong on so many levels.
Let's take a closer look at the game itself.
So we have some gameplay right here. This is in the beginning. This is not really gameplay. It's just some shots of Leon walking with the third-person perspective from behind.
The over-the-shoulder.
So I like the way the game looks right here. I like the position of the over-the-shoulder perspective. The camera seems further away from Leon, which is not a problem in Resident Evil 4, really. But, yeah, so it seems like he doesn't have his gun equipped. So it's probably going to use a lot of the same controls as Resident Evil 2 Remake. Because it seems like they're doing this as a trend to make every single third-person over-the-shoulder game like have very similar animations to Resident Evil 2 Remake. Must be that.
The camera returns, of course. We want to nail the feeling of loneliness and fear of not knowing what lies ahead, even more so than the original. Of course.
So, you see right there, Leon dynamically took out his weapon, or maybe they disabled the HUD, and they just pressed something on the D-pad to actually pull out his weapon.
Of course. There will also...
And we have this camera perspective right here, just like in Resident Evil 4. But it looks like the laser sight isn't returning. That's stupid. The laser sight was such an iconic aspect to Resident Evil 4. And because they originally introduced the laser sight in Resident Evil 4, that then carried over to the VR version. And the problem I have with VR games in general is when they don't provide a laser sight, because the actual iron sight provided on your weapon when you're using it in VR, it isn't accurate, it isn't honest, and that's why there are so many moments where I miss my shots in the VR games. But with Resident Evil 4 VR, they were smart to include the laser sight, so I knew exactly where I was shooting. And the laser sight was such a crucial part to Resident Evil 4 assuming its place as being the very first over-the-shoulder perspective, because the laser sight served as a way for people to actually get used to the controls and to actually see where they were aiming, because at the time, I don't think reticles were really a thing. I mean, maybe like Splinter Cell was a little different. But I don't know when Splinter Cell released, because I know Splinter Cell had the over-the-shoulder perspective when you were aiming, and they had a reticle, but which was not entirely honest. They also had a laser sight as well, but regardless, the laser sight is a crucial part to the gameplay in Resident Evil 4, 5, and 6. It's such a unique way to ground your aiming within the world itself, and it leads you to trust your shots. There's no random variable on your reticle like in the Evil Within. Like you trust where you're pointing your weapon, and it led to a lot of honesty. But it seems like right here they're not doing that. They're favoring a traditional reticle style, which is very generic and not really that cool. Like the laser sight is such an iconic part of Resident Evil 4, and it seems like they're ignoring it here, which is disappointing.
There'll be thrilling battles. People that...
And also right there, that crouch animation, just the way that looked, it doesn't seem like a context-sensitive crouch animation where you just walk up to that point and Leon just automatically does an animation. It seems like there's button input involved because of how sudden the crouching is and with the way the animation looks. So is there going to be a crouch button on this game? It seems like it. I wonder if that's going to be a thing where you do have the ability to hide from the enemies but not do stealth attacks on them, which is stupid. Because I remember in Resident Evil 2 Remake, in some of the developer gameplay that they did where they were actually playing alongside someone else, like some other interviewer. Like, the interviewer had said, is there going to be stealth attacks in this game? And developers were like, nope, even though that doesn't make any fucking sense and it feels completely inhuman to sneak up behind a zombie but not have the ability to jam your knife into their head. And like that just feels like such a logical survivor tactic, like an actual tactical strategy to save up on your ammunition, but they're like, no, don't bother adhering to that logic. That's and it seems like they're doing something here where they're giving Leon the ability to crouch because of the way the animation looks. It doesn't seem like a context-sensitive animation. It feels like an actual button input, given the way the animation looks, given how sudden the transition from standing to crouching was. It seems like it's governed by a button input. But it seems like on this game you might have the ability to hide behind low pieces of cover, but not be able to sneak kill enemies, which is stupid. But whatever, let's continue.
That played the recent Resident Evil 2 and
See, like, right there, like, why did it take so long for Leon to stand up? This is why I'm saying it doesn't seem like it's a context-sensitive animation. It feels like there is a button input governing whether Leon is crouching or not.
Resident Evil 2.
But if they're actually taking an aspect from Resident Evil 7, that could be really cool. I can't wait to... If they put crouching as a fundamental mechanic in Resident Evil 4 Remake, that would be really cool. And because crouching was so good in Resident Evil 7, this is something that could translate into really good gameplay. Like, do you know the times where the enemies did certain attacks in Resident Evil 4 that you should be able to crouch under, but you actually can't? Like, for instance, the flail attacks, or also when regenerators grab you with their long-range grab. It looks like you should be able to crouch under it. And the thing is that same grab animation was in Resident Evil 7 with the molded, but you could actually crouch under it. Oh boy, won't that be interesting to have such a passive mechanic for the purposes of going to low spaces become a utility for dodging attacks? That is so cool, and it's something that Shinji Mikami reintroduced in Ghostwire Tokyo as well with Yasuo Toko 2 when you dodged his charge attack with water. And at the time in my blind playthrough, I didn't know what I was supposed to be doing, but to actually have that light bulb click in my head and think back to Resident Evil 7. Oh man, that was so satisfying. And if they designed the gameplay of Resident Evil 4 Remake to be accommodating for people who actually take a lot of time to invest in this game, and their investment is rewarded by understanding hidden mechanics, like with crouching to dodge attacks, using a passive crouch mechanic to dodge attacks, that'll be fantastic.
Resident Evil 3 should find this familiar.
But that's all they have to show for here.
Where we'll have more information on the game.
Yeah, so after that, like after positing a lot of possible explanations for certain designs in Resident Evil 4 Remake, I'm a lot more excited for Resident Evil 4 Remake, even though I still have my initial hesitations and negatives towards this remake of Resident Evil 4 in the wake of Resident Evil Village.
Resident Evil 7, which brought...
I also brought in some footage of this as well, but they've remastered Resident Evil 7, Resident Evil 2 Remake, and Resident Evil 3 Remake. I have the remastered versions of those games. The strange thing, though, is Resident Evil 7 Remastered, it doesn't give you the ability to do a free PS5 upgrade, even though they said it would be. Like, if you go to the PlayStation Store page for Resident Evil 2 Remake and Resident Evil 3 Remake, it says on their title cards, free PS5 upgrade. And then you click it, you go to the right, and you're able to download a free PS5 upgrade. But that option doesn't exist for Resident Evil 7. And it might be due to the way I installed Resident Evil 7 initially. So maybe because of that, or maybe they didn't integrate the free PS5 upgrade immediately for Resident Evil 7, even though they actually did. Like, maybe they didn't. Maybe they had the remastered version in the store, but they forgot to implement the shortcut for actually implementing that free PS5 upgrade. Maybe that's the case with what happened. But I had to delete the game and purchase the remastered version for $20. But it's fine, I don't care, because I don't care with the pricing of it. A remastered Resident Evil 7 is phenomenal, and I am definitely going to be doing a live stream of Resident Evil 7 Remastered, because it's worth it. Don't bother seeing a live stream of Resident Evil 2 Remake and Resident Evil 3 Remake Remastered, given that I don't really like those games. Obviously, Resident Evil 2 Remake is a fucking stupid game. I hate it. It's the second from the bottom in terms of my ranking of the series, but Resident Evil 3 Remake is kind of a nothing title. It doesn't really do Nemesis justice, and it's too short, and the scenarios are better put together, I would say, but the lack of content does leave a lot to be desired, even though it doesn't affect me too much compared to other people. That's why I'm not doing live streams of those games, and I haven't played Resident Evil 2 Remake in almost a year, and I don't see myself returning to that game unless I decide to do some stupid live stream or something, or maybe some other walkthrough if I decide to do it again, where I have to echo some very negative thoughts, pretty much.
The series back to its survival horror roots.
Yeah, I only put in that portion. Fuck Resident Evil 2 Remake and Resident Evil 3 Remake segments. I've only put this part, Resident Evil 7, which brought the series back to its survival horror roots. I mean, that right there is a pretty bigoted and ignorant statement because the survival horror aspect has always existed in the likes of Resident Evil 4, 5, 6, Revelations, Revelations 2. And like saying it brought the series back to its survival horror roots, that's like saying, oh, we brought the series back to what made Resident Evil 1 Remake what it was, but this game is not Resident Evil 1 Remake, which is fantastic, because Resident Evil 1 Remake is the worst Resident Evil game ever. It's the worst mainline Resident Evil game ever. It's so boring, it's so simple in its designs, it doesn't do anything exceptional like Resident Evil 3 did. It's just a very simple game with a very stupid inventory system, just no incentive to use guns whatsoever, simple enemy designs, badly designed bosses. It's trash. It really is trash. There are so many designs that are so negligible in Resident Evil 1 Remake, and you could easily get the same experience that I go through with the true experience of Resident Evil 1 Remake, and that is not the survival horror route that Resident Evil 7 brought the series back to. It's a different route, but not muddied or like corrupted or poisoned by the realm of ignorance.
Survival horror roots.
And then this final part right here, welcome to the family, son.
Welcome to the family.
That right there was a nice homage to Resident Evil 7. That right there was using an iconic line for really good fan service. I really enjoyed that. But yeah, guys, I'm sure you can summarize based on what I just said in the video. I am very disappointed, offended, and insulted by the DLC for Resident Evil Village. I'm voicing a lot more excitement for Resident Evil 4 Remake, and I'm very excited about the remaster for Resident Evil 7. So I hope you guys have been able to digest a lot of what I just said and why I'm disappointed in the DLC for Resident Evil Village, and I'm excited for the other things that I've just listed. Thank you all for watching, and you take care now.